Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razor Leaf, your secret weapon for all things digital in products and manufacturing. In past episodes, we've explored everything from PLM systems to IDEs and architecture patterns. Today, we're tying it all together by discussing what it means to have multiple PLM systems or tools in your organization. In past episodes, we've explored everything from PLM systems to IDEs and architecture patterns. Today, we're tying it all together by discussing what it means to have multiple PLM systems or tools in your organization. Our podcast hosts, Jonathan and Jen, break down the complexity of handling different systems, whether from the same or different vendors, cross business units, or for various functions, and explore patterns like federated systems, hub and spoke models, and more. So stick around as we unpack the pros, cons, and strategies of managing multiple PLM systems and how to stay sharp in this ever-evolving digital world.
Welcome back, everyone, to Stay Sharp, the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. I am Jen Frillo, and I am joined today by my friend and co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hi, everybody.
In past episodes, we have talked about PLM system capabilities. We've talked a lot, in fact, about a PLM. We've talked about IDEs. We've talked about architectural patterns and all sorts of fun stuff. Today, we're going to talk about putting a few of those things together and talking about what it means to have multiple PLM systems or tools in the same organization and why you might want to do something that sounds that crazy.
That's right. Something that sounds that nuts.
Like why? Anyway, so we're all clear, I think, on what a PLM system is. If you're not clear, there's lots of podcasts in the past so you can catch up to defining what PLM is and what a PLM system is, some of the capabilities, et cetera. But the basic definition is it's where the majority of product data that fuels a digital thread is contained. It might not have all of it, but it is certainly the hub of that information, which makes it almost an imperative for maintaining a digital thread. But I mean, PLM systems can get pretty complex, especially when you start talking about various integrations, et cetera. What does it mean? Why would you need to have multiple PLM systems in one organization? What does that even mean?
It's a great question. Glad we got it as a topic. Actually, I want to back up to one other thing too, okay. Jen. You mentioned IDEs that we talked about in the past.
Right.
So there is an episode on that. But just a quick catch up on that topic too. When we say that here, the context we mean is integrated digital environment. And that's something that we hear more and more working with our government partners, our government customers, folks working in the defense and aerospace spaces. And the idea being it's almost like PLM++,
right?
PLM and other stuff.
Right. And thank you for catching me that. I know when we throw out acronyms, we're supposed to define them. So thank you for for filling everybody in on that.
But so we got PLM, we got IDEs, and we got this idea of having multiple PLM systems, in your IDEs or across IDEs or just in your business or whatever it is. And so back to your question, like why would you want to have that? What does that even mean? What are we even talking about there? So let's start there, right? With what do we mean by having more than one PLM system?
I mean, I'm guessing. I was going to say, I'm guessing the obvious answer, and I'm sure there's more to it than this, since the obvious answer is not always the right one, is that it simply means you have two different PLM systems from two different software vendors.
I think that's an easy one, right? That's a logical one, and it does come up. So I think that's right. It's not the only way you can do it, but so let's call that option one, or at least the first one that comes to our mind. Like, I've got Windchill and I've got Teamcenter. Okay, I've got two different systems. And that could have happened for a number of reasons, and we should talk about the why in a minute, but that's one, right? Okay.
Right.
How about another one? You've got different systems for two different groups in your company, whatever those groups might be, but maybe it's the same software, right? So you've got, I don't know, let's go to a 3D experience now. I got a 3D experience for the group that makes pumps, and I've got a 3D experience for the group that makes motors because they don't share many parts. And, again, I won't try to get into the why, but let's just assume you get two different ones for the two different groups. That's another one, right? That's
two different instances,
right?
basically then, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
2 different instances. And let's not even talk about like versions necessarily, but they're totally separate, right? So a user in one is not a user in the other. Okay, so then you got 2 PLM systems at that point. Okay, that's another one. What about, let's like that last one, let me put a little more context on it so that I can get to a third one that's I'll differentiate, right? So that was just, hey, when the pump business does design and all the development of their products, they've got their PLM, and when the motor business does theirs, they got the other. What if you differentiated instead on function, right?
What do you mean
so
by
it's
that?
like the corporate has Windchill as their PLM for all product release, right? And product records, right? It's for record keeping, for longevity or regulatory or whatever.
Okay.
But the pump group has Smart Team for product development, right? So, but when they're ready to release a drawing, maybe they move it up to the corporate one or that. So different function. One's like record keeping and maybe information distribution, but the other is development cycles, or maybe somebody's got a PLM that they use for another functional case, like they're using it for simulation lifecycle management. Oh, I take my designs in, I do a bunch of simulation processes and iterations and keep the data, that kind of thing. So just different functionally. So I think maybe it's related to the one we just talked about, but I try to separate them just to be clear. That's another reason people might separate, or way they might have them separated.
Is it ever based on specific, I guess it must be, right? It's based on specific needs of the business or the functional silo within an organization. I know silo is a bad word. Do we ever run into the same, where you've got the same vendor, but different PLM systems? So for instance, you mentioned Windchill from PTC.
Right.
Do we run into instances where they have Windchill from PTC, but then they also have Arena, which is from PTC as well?
Sure, right? Or, I've still got Legacy Smart Team, but I'm also running 3D Experience. Or, with Team Center, I've still got an old, Team Center engineering instance, but I'm also running Unified over here. Or, lots of variations of that, and you could speak about interesting ones today with PTC. And, I've got, if we're not being totally, disciplined about the PLM term, maybe I'm running Onshape managing my CAD data, right? And that's a PTC tool. But maybe I've also got Arena doing the PLM, but I've also got Windchill managing my Creo data, So, you could have a lot from one vendor and different PDM or PLM systems potentially.
Again, I'm coming back to wow, that's a lot. That sounds like a big mess to me.
And it might be a big mess, right? But there also might be good reasons behind it. And that's why I think it's so good to dig into this topic, right? Is to talk about some of we should, after we're done, with what do we mean by this, some pluses and minuses, because there are some really good reasons to do some of this, even though you could be creating some complexity and making a mess too. So you have to balance some of that, and really understand your why. But I think there are a couple of other ways to talk about having multiple PLM systems that we haven't gotten to yet. I'll throw another one out at you that's interesting. So not just same vendor, different software, but what about same vendor, same software, different versions, right? So maybe I was back in that kind of mode that we described a second ago where, 2 different groups within the company have the same software. Pumps uses Windchill, Motors uses Team Center. Okay, let's say they both used Windchill, but at different versions because they had a different upgrade cycle, or because one was an acquisition, or they had a integration that they couldn't move, or I don't know, right? Any number of reasons, but okay. So now I've got, or Innovia, I've got 2013X, 2017X, and 2022X all running under my roof somewhere. That kind of thing, that's still having multiple PLM systems, and there might be other differentiations there too, like that they're set up differently somehow. So this could be a blend of the ones that we are talking about so far, right?
Okay.
That maybe they're configured differently, but they're also different versions.
So if I can summarize then, so when we're talking about different PLM systems, we're talking about the PLM system itself, we're talking version of the PLM system, and we are talking about the configuration of the PLM system.
I think that's right. Yeah.
That capture pretty much everything, right?
I think so. And in just terms of vernacular, the language I would use is that those are unique instances, right?
Yes.
Each sort of setup is an instance, and that instance can have its own software, version, configuration, content, whatever, however you want to characterize it, right? But that's really what we're talking about. I mean, I think we kind of backed into this in terms of what's the episode about today, but why is there any reason to have multiple PLM instances in your organization, in your business, in your supply chain, design chain, whatever the organization scope you want to look at? But why would you ever want to have more than one instance? And then what's the variability across those instances, and what does that variability mean? Whether it's variability of software, of version, of configuration, that kind of thing.
Okay.
That kind of gets us to what we're talking about, I think.
Okay. So
you know us, though. It takes me a minute to meander to it. But.
It does. So do we want to go down the why would you ever want to do something crazy like that? Or do we want to go down more about the, hey, you know what? The why doesn't matter so much. Here we are. We've got multiple PLM systems. How do we make sense of it all? How do we, what sort of patterns do we use when we're trying to implement these across and integrate them really across our organizations? Where do you want to go?
Let's talk about patterns. That's a good one. Let's dig into that. And it's hard to separate these cleanly. So I think just like we have been, we'll talk a little bit about the why, or maybe not even, I guess it is the why. Maybe the how did you get here has something to do with it.
Well, that's the why.
It is. It's the why did it happen? It may not be the why you want to keep it that way. That's worth getting into too, I think. But patterns are good, right? So let's talk about patterns. I think we alluded to one a minute ago when I was describing maybe you've got like a corporate setup and different divisions that make different products, pumps and motors. So one common setup I've seen in large organizations is this, I'll call it a federated pattern, where you use one PLM for one function at each division, each product line, I don't know how you want to divide it up. And then there's one ring to rule them all, right? There's like an umbrella that rides across them for the enterprise that is that record keeping, or it might not be record keeping, it might be regulatory compliance or quality or some other corporate function, overarching function you need to do where you're looking at that element of your product family's collective life cycle, right? So it's almost like the scope of that umbrella one is different from the scope of the product line specific ones or division specific ones, that kind of thing. But that's one pattern.
And I could certainly see where it would make that kind of, when we're talking about interspersing the why, like I could see where that could happen like as part of an acquisition strategy. So you've got all these multiple companies, they're using their own PLM systems. You want, for efficiency, with at least near term, you want them to keep doing their day-to-day processes exactly the same way. But at a company level, you have to roll it all up. So I could see where that would make sense.
Yeah. Or to your point about efficiency, and again, we're getting into why, but I think it's reasonable, right? I mean, there are reasons. It's good to talk about patterns and why at the same time. But there may be other reasons why that makes sense to you from an efficiency perspective, and I don't know. But you're right. I think you're exactly right. How you got there may have something to do with why you're interested in that pattern, because you needed to roll things up. You need to combine things. You need to look at things from that perspective. Or you said localized efficiency is better, but some things have to be connected. Anyway, okay, so that's one pattern. There might be another way to get at, or there is another way to get at some of those goals you just mentioned. And that is, instead of having one system act as kind of an overlay to everything where things just bubble up to it, I've seen other businesses have sort of a hub and spoke type of architecture to their multiple instances. So it's similar to what we just said, like each division maybe gets its own PLM instance and it's configured its own way. But the hub in the middle is actually not there just to collect, but it's actually there to kind of translate among them and maybe hold some of its own content that gets shared back to them. I'll give you an example. Let's say we've got say we make some kind of machine where the machine component, it's our secret sauce is like the the packaging piece, right? So that packaging machine that's part of our overall machine that, I don't know, makes widgets and packages them. One division does the whole integrated system, and it sells customers an entire integrated system for making widgets, packaging widgets, putting it into their automation line, that sort of thing. But the other division just makes the packaging machine, right? So what we find there, though, is that the one division, the people who do the whole integrated assembly line, they need to use the end product as a product from the other group. Okay. So each one may look different in terms of, like, one's kind of a systems integrator and one's a product builder. So they're going to have different PLMs, maybe with different setups, configurations, how they behave. And let's say there's another division in the company that does something else entirely different, but they all still use the same hardware, fasteners, commodity components, that kind of thing. Okay, so maybe that organization has a PLM in the middle that's their hub, that's where their standard part libraries are, where their common components are, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But it also knows how to move data, bills of material, or whatever is important across from, I don't know, one division to another, one division to any other, multiple divisions. Maybe it's their global, right? So it's like you're taking that packaging machine that's our secret sauce, but you're making it available to the Europe, the Asia, and the North America operations. And they've each got their own local PLM because when they do their deployments of the assembly lines, they use localized components. I don't know. I'm making up scenarios, but you get the idea that what they need is some ability to move subsets of data around very efficiently. And they're not trying to standardize everybody to make them all behave the same way. And it's not as simple as that sort of umbrella mode I described a second ago, where it's like, well, yeah, just when you're done, bubble the records up to us. Or, let me check regulatory, or, long-term archiving, or, something where it's really a one-way thing. So that hub and spoke, I think, is another pattern worth mentioning when we're talking about this and why people might do it.
Okay, so we've got so we've got the umbrella approach, where basically it's almost more of a, I don't want to say oversight, but for things like compliance, regulatory, et cetera. And then you've got the hub and spoke, which within an organization sounds like a much more functional type, where you've got libraries, you've got data flowing back and forth among the different spokes. What about the organization, when you talk about the organization as a whole, but you're talking about more than one company? We were talking about like partners, suppliers and partners.
I think the first two patterns we talked about can apply there too, but I think there's another one that brings up. And this is most often happens in that situation you just described, which is just a peer-to-peer kind of situation. And this, again, might be in the same organization, it might be with trading partners, but simply, I've got two different PLMs for a project team that's working on a car, an airplane, something with a big supplier design chain, and they've just got different systems. Maybe they're different companies, maybe they're not, but they are just sharing some data back and forth, and that level of data sharing can be deep or light or who knows, and it could change over time, could change project to project. But that peer-to-peer, that's another simple pattern that we don't want to ignore, right? Which is just one PLM system talking to another PLM system, and they need to kind of translate or correlate or something so that when the data moves across, it doesn't lose context and doesn't lose something important as it's shared. But I think that's another important pattern.
So, you start talking about data and you start talking about moving data and back and forth. Like, that to me sounds like integration.
I think it is a lot of times, but it does not have to be. So that one we just talked about with trading partners could be done manually. The hub and spoke one could be done manually. And frankly, that federated one I described, I've seen that one done manually plenty of times until somebody goes and makes the business case and says, I need to automate it. So, but really any of these, you could have multiple PLMs and still, sneaker net, using an older term for that concept, but, move data around in a very manual fashion, or you could integrate it. And then when you think about integrating it, then you get more patterns that come into play when you think about that. But yeah, it could go either way.
But those patterns are in some way mirrors of some of the ones we've talked about. We've talked about, peer-to-peer, we've talked about hub and spoke. I mean, so those are very similar in ways that you can, different ways that you can integrate systems.
They can be. But it's interesting because I think on the the episode where we talked some about that, about some patterns and integration patterns and that sort of thing, at least in my mind, as we were discussing it, everything I'm thinking about is assuming one PLM instance and building out a digital thread to ERP, MRP, MES, MBSE, requirement system, all these other systems that we would connect to.
Right.
But the reality is that type of integration could also be talking about this topic here of, well, my digital thread runs across 3 PLM instances from 2 vendors with 3 different versions of software, plus 4 ERPs, 2 MESs, and a partridge in a pear tree. That's the reality, right? That's what people have.
It is the reality. And again, that comes back to why on earth would you do this? Why would it, it just sounds so complex. So
it does.
And I don't know. But the reality is you do what you have to keep your organization going, keep your digital thread, your data flowing. So if you've acquired these companies or you have these specific reasons to have different divisions using different, you have to make it work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And maybe, this gets us to the why, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes the why is a historical why, like you just said. If you've acquired these companies, if this happened, right, and it happened to you,
Right.
You have these things, that is what it is. Then the question becomes, all right, now what's the value to changing? And to your point leading in here, sometimes the value to changing is reducing complexity, but you have to be able to, put a label, maybe even a number on that value to make a decision about consolidating or changing the way that they're differentiated or whatever it might be. But I think that's where getting into the why of why might you want to do it could help inform, do you want to do something about it if the real why is, well, because somebody handed it to me like that. That's what I got dealt,
Well, you're right, because you're getting to the point that, there are, and maybe this is where we go with it, there are pros and cons to each of these different approaches and each of the different patterns for using the different PLM systems. And that may inform whether or not you stay. You know what? It's actually working. It's complex, it's kind of scary, but it's working. And right now, our biggest thing is just to get the product out the door and don't upset the apple cart. The other reason, but then on the flip side, maybe okay, we feel like we've done some due diligence. We feel like we're losing serious efficiencies here by maintaining all of this. So when you start digging in, what are some of the pros and cons with the different approaches that we've been talking about?
So I'm just going to start rattling things off that they're
Wait,
on my mind.
you're going to start rattling?
Okay, fair enough. All right, I have been, but I think the first one that's easy is it's flexibility. That's a pro, right? Mm-hmm. When you go to do a PLM system deployment anywhere, if you're in consulting or IT and you've done more than one, you'll I hopefully agree with me when I say this. You recognize very quickly that engineers would all like to have it their way. Again,
what?
I'm an engineer. I feel okay saying that.
Yes.
We do.
I'm an engineer. I feel okay hearing it too. So
yeah. Okay, good. We can all just agree on that. And maybe it's a human condition thing, not an engineering thing, but whatever. Everybody likes to have it their way. And so, you go to different groups, different divisions, different units, different product lines, whatever it may be. People are going to be like, well, no. To be most efficient, we need to do this or do that or whatever it might be. And that's the way we think, right? In teams, in groups, as we collaborate, we try to optimize our efficiency. And sometimes that means if I was making a pump, I'd do it this way. If I was making a motor, I'd do it that way. And so I'd like to have the flexibility to have my PLM system optimized to exactly my needs. That always has to have a balance, right? Because if you gave a new PLM system to every group of 3 engineers who work together on every project, you'd have way too many PLM systems.
Right.
But on the flip side, we talked about IDEs at the beginning, right?
Right.
I'll give an example of, government programs, right? And so from the government side, right, having done work with the Navy, right, they are a bit compartmentalized when it comes to different weapons platforms, right? They're in different program offices. They work in different ways. They have different needs. They're at different points in the life cycle. All these things, right? And they all need a digital thread, and they need a digital thread for different reasons. They're at different stages of maturity. That flexibility of each of them having their own way of dealing with their data that best suits their needs for the life of that program, where it's at today and moving forward, actually is really helpful. right? Now, they may also need to have an umbrella or hub and spoke or, get back to some other patterns. But that flexibility can be invaluable because I know, having been in these projects, I can tell you, you do not want to try and manage the product data coming from a certain vendor for an aircraft in the same system as the product data being used to maintain a 30-year-old ship. You don't want to do that. It's going to be bad for everybody, right? Okay. So flexibility, I think, is a big pro in this approach of having different PLMs.
And I can totally see that. And like I said, I mean, being an engineer and a human, I can see yes, I would like to have things my way. However, running a business, et cetera, there is a cost to that flexibility. Yeah. And the fact is you've got multiple PLM systems. I mean, they are called PLM systems for a reason. One assumes, because we've actually done a podcast on it, different capabilities, actually maybe 2 podcasts on it, different capabilities that PLM systems have.
Right.
So that means at some level, you've got overlapping, if not redundant functionality. True?
Maybe. Well, think about what we said our different modes were. I think in some cases, yes. So I should start by saying, yes, I agree with you, right? So if your situation was, I've got a Teamcenter and a Windchill, that means that you're paying license money to Siemens for Teamcenter and to PTC for Windchill. And let's assume you bought roughly the same thing, the pumps and motors example, right? We're both doing a mechanical product and one's got one, one's got the other. So CAD file management and bill of material management and change management and security and logins and doc management and rev control. All these things, you're paying both vendors to do that. Now, if they're doing it by license counts and users and things like that, well, maybe you shouldn't look at that as doubling up entirely, right? Because you got 100 users in one system, and so you pay Siemens for 100 users of that stuff, and you got 200 users in the other system. You pay PTC for 200 users to that stuff. Okay, maybe. But there is some stuff that maybe you did duplicate, right? Could you have, if you put 300 users together, would you have had almost the same size server if they were using one software, So having 2 softwares from 2 different vendors does mean maybe you are paying twice to set up the system, to manage, have the resources for the system, help desk, all those kinds of things. And some places maybe you aren't totally paying twice because you're only paying for the number of people, if that's what their licensing model is. And some PLM vendors, it's not that. So could be that too. But to your point, there's a cost there that this con maybe you can look at as a little bit of a pro if your mode is different. So that's why I said, yes, I agree with you, but there's another side to this. So let's say you are using 2 different instances that are 2 different versions of the same software from the same vendor. Right. And if you were maybe able to do volume pricing from that vendor, then maybe it doesn't really matter, right? You got a better deal because you put all the users in together, even though they're 2 different PLM systems. They're 2 different instances for you, right? But you bought in bulk because you bought from one vendor. So it gets weird, right? You have to really analyze it to say, is that a con? Is it a pro? Is it, I don't know. But you have to think about that piece, which is, how are you paying for all the pieces of it? Are they redundant, additive, complementary, save a little bit, synergistic? I don't know.
Well, and to your point, so you're right, that's not a position I considered. So it's not, we're talking about you've got 2 different instances of the same PLM system. So you get the same vendor, you are getting, let's assume you're getting tier pricing and you're getting volume discounting there. However, I'd still argue cost is not just the cost of the software, right?
That's right.
It's the cost of the data flow back and forth. It's the cost of maintaining 2 different systems on 2 different versions, and the cost of upgrading 2 different systems. So those are all costs to consider as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you really have to get into the details of it and start to balance the pros against the cons, right? Because let's say that your pro was that flexibility thing I mentioned before. Back to our pump and motor company. Okay, we're both using 3D Experience. We're both using 3D Experience 2022X, but we configured them differently for pumps and motors because they each said, hey, I can be a more optimal business if I get my own configuration. Okay, so maybe we share help desk resources. We share server resources. We share, We share all kinds of stuff But there are a few things that are different so we can maintain our flexibility. That's one of those moments where maybe you say, actually, the pros outweigh the cons. And that reason for having multiple instances is fantastic. But you really have to measure it because, to your point, take it make a few little tweaks to that equation. And you say, well, actually, it's Team Center and it's 3D Experience and it's different groups of people. And one, I work with the vendor, but another, I work with a consultant. And then all of a sudden the complexity explodes and it outweighs the benefit of that flexibility that I was looking for. Mm-hmm. So I think your point is spot on. These pros and cons, none of them are absolute. You have to use them to kind of calculate your situation.
Right. I'm curious because it's one other thing that I've seen really in the engineering industry as a whole is the rise of the concept of a platform, having a singular platform, okay, that all of your applications, that all of your integrations, et cetera, they all feed in. And in that case, you're getting everything from one vendor and it's all the same. So there's no multiple PLM systems, there's no multiple versions, et cetera. That certainly, that does give you a certain lack of flexibility. And I could see where, say, for instance, the federated approach, the umbrella approach, actually allows the pendulum to swing the other way. Because it's, at least in my experience in the industry, it's kind of gone back and forth between all your, one vendor, all of the things, versus multiple vendors, best in class.
Yep.
And I could see where if you've got the federated pattern, where you've got one overarching PLM system and then lots of individuals, it really allows you to select best in class for either the product or the function or division or what have you.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly the case. And it could be that, you're not necessarily optimizing on vendor or on the software, but on version or on configuration or on any number of things. But your point's well made. If best of breed feels like where it's at for you and you're good with heterogeneous and having multiple instances of things because of flexibility, because of whatever, then yeah, I mean, I think you can get tremendous benefit out of that. And you can also build up some capabilities, whether they're internal or external, that can really be a pro for you in terms of agility and flexibility. I shouldn't say flexibility because we just talked about that one. Let's say agility, right? So take the example that you just described. I've taken a best of breed approach. I'm not going monolithic with a platform and everybody use it. I'm going with there's one umbrella, but then every division can kind of pick your own. And if you've got a function that needs to pick their own, they can too. But in the course of building out that strategy as an IT and engineering and manufacturing business, you likely developed some integration capabilities. You've had to be able to support that best of breed approach. Again, whether internal or external. But if you've built that out and you maintain that capability, you have sort of like an extra superpower when it's time for an acquisition.
It's true.
I won't say necessarily a divestment because that may require kind of a different superpower. But at least for acquisition, right? You go buy company X and they've got 5 locations and two PLM systems, but you're an old hand at this. You've done this before. You're like, right, here's what our federated system looks like. Here are the published subscribed standards of what I need and what I can give you back. And here's the integration tools or capability or whatever it is we use. And we've used these partners. So let's go do it again. You're repeating something that you've already understood how to do. Right. That can be a big pro in terms of how fast can you absorb that business and get synergy out of it, right? And for any business folks listening to this, I'm hoping their ears perk up. They're like, oh, that is interesting. So what you're telling me is it could be a real benefit of having multiple PLM systems in my business today because it makes me more nimble at acquisition activity in the future. Yeah, I would say it could. I'm not saying it does every time, but it could if you do it a certain way. Yeah.
So I'm going to bring up a similar situation, but on the supplier side of things. And so, for instance, there's, engine or manufacturing companies are not the only places where acquisitions happen, right? Mm-hmm. So you even see that in the PLM space.
Sure.
So your PLM vendors have, like, a matter of fact, PTC acquired Arena, as a good example. And way back in the day, Dassault acquired, Matrix.
Matrix, they built Smart Team. They built all kinds of people. Yep.
Right. So, I mean, I could see where also if you've got multiple PLM systems and your vendor goes away or the product end of lives, or like basically if you've got, then you already have data there as far as like, okay, this one is good for this. This one is good for that. We've already got implemented this one over here. So you've got knowledge, you've got experience, et cetera, with multiple vendors, and you could probably more easily pivot to a different PLM system based on that.
Yeah. Again, it's like the one we just talked about. It can lead to that sort of superpower or, strengthening that muscle of like, is my product data, my digital product data portable? Can I move it around? Could I deal with putting it in a new system? Can I handle getting more product data that maybe is a little different shape, looks a little different? Can I figure out how to put that in play in my business quickly? So, yeah, I think so, right? I think the more you're ready to deal with those situations because of having had to do it already, the more nimble you can be when they come up. I think there's another piece that you mentioned, or another thought it brings up based on what you mentioned about the vendors on that side, the supplier side, not talking about companies and who they might buy, but when the PLM software vendors buy somebody. If you have multiple tools from these different PLM companies, you also get some risk mitigation and maybe some negotiation power. And those are, I don't know if they're two sides of the same coin or just closely related, but I feel like they're connected somehow, that if you've got a tool from, Siemens and one from Dassault, you can regularly be talking to both of them about, well, I do kind of like the other one better. So when it's time for price negotiations, you've got something to dangle. Yeah, a little bit of carrot, right? A little bit of stick, that kind of thing. And, whether that's what you intend to do or not, the threat is always there and real if they know you are maintaining two and you're using two and that sort of thing. And you also, aside from negotiations, you also are mitigating your risk, to your point about consolidation or whatever may happen in the industry with those vendors and those software tools, right? Pick your favorite PDM or PLM from 10 years ago that might be going away soon. There are a handful in that boat.
There are.
What do you do about that? If all of your data is there and it's been there and you really have not thought about this and you're not very good at moving your data around or figuring out how to integrate it or things like that, it could be in a tough spot and over a barrel trying to deal with it. But if you've gotten nimble at managing or dealing with both, you might be fine. You might feel confident that I can get that where I need it to be, that sort of thing. So it's, again, they aren't directly related, but I feel like they're connected in some way in terms of pros and cons of this multiple PLM approach.
Well, and it's funny because one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking about the risk mitigation, the fact that like you can be kind of like, well, I could go this direction or I could go this direction, and using negotiations, because I'm in sales, an unforeseen cost that you might be bearing there is, well, guess what? The vendors know that too. So they're me bugging the crap out of you about like, hey, how about we get you to move to? Yep. So there is that. So, all right, I'm keeping an eye on our time, and I know we're getting closer, a little bit over as we often are.
I got one more though.
Okay,
you can't wrap up on me yet. I got one more.
All right.
So don't. It'll be quick. This is going to sound counterintuitive, right, from people that do integration work, because we do a lot of integration work. But don't forget, a con of this approach is that integration has a cost, whether it's manual integration, right, or it's automated integration and putting systems in place to tie all these systems together, that kind of thing. Just don't forget about that, right? So we talked about flexibility, that's great, and we talked about some cons. Well, integration has a cost, whether it is complexity of that integration or just the time spent to do it. There's something there, and don't ignore it, right? So when you're doing the calculus, I just didn't want that one to not be said because we listed off a bunch of good, pros and cons, but don't forget that one.
Well, and I think we did at least touch on it some because we were talking about the flexibility, but then, that there comes a cost, and it's not just the integration, it's the maintaining, et cetera. So I'm going to ask you as a little bit of a different, what do you think are the primary points that people should walk away from this particular podcast with?
So I'm going to say, I'm going to be contrarian and say, the title of the podcast is why would you need multiple PLM systems or multiple PLM systems? What does it mean, right? And I think the gut reaction for most folks is going to be like, well, you wouldn't. You want to get down to one. They're complex. You want to have as few of these as possible. And so I'm going to take the contrarian view and say, I don't think that's true. I think you want to analyze it. So
Yes.
I'm not saying you want multiples. I'm not saying you want only one, but I'm saying it is not it's not a done deal thing. It's a thing you should analyze based on your business strategy. And I think that's important about lots of things we talk about on this podcast, right? Is that whatever you're doing with digital thread, digital twin, any kind of digitalization, how does it fit with your business strategy, right? So if you're in merger and acquisition mode, this multiple PLM system thing might be the best thing since sliced bread.
Right.
Get good at integration. Get good at consuming other companies and putting things together. But that would be my takeaway is this is a problem that needs to be analyzed. You need to look at it and you need to think about it in terms of your strategy and you need to constantly align it because you also might be in the middle of merger and acquisition craziness, right? And you've got all these, but at some point you say it's time to consolidate and maybe get down to 1 or 3 or 2 or I don't know. But that's my takeaway, right? Is this is an important topic and it's one you should analyze. And it's not that the same answer is right for the same organization all the time. It can change. So that's my take.
No, I think you're right. I think it's a complex question and a complex solution, and it will change. There's no single right answer is what I'm getting at. There's no single right answer. It is very dependent on your business and where you are in its evolution. So it's something that I imagine that at the highest level of a company and certainly within the highest level of IT, people need to be constantly thinking about, strategizing, and then rethinking about as they move forward. Okay, we've got everything that we need as far as acquisitions. We're not looking to acquire more companies. So let's look at building in some efficiencies and then maybe better prepare us for our next steps as an organization. So I think it's good advice. So
yeah. And I could keep going. I won't. But I could keep going because there's other pros, there's other cons. There's lots of other things to look at here. But
that's always where we end, right? And hopefully that's what our listeners are using this for too. You're not coming here for a singular answer. You're coming here for thought-provoking conversations and things to think about moving forward. So things to keep under consideration. So
I hope so.
Thank you for joining me today, Jonathan. It's a great discussion.
That was another good one. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did as well. And it's one that I really would like our listeners to reach out. It's a much more interesting conversation if it's not just Jonathan and I talking, but if you're all in this as well. So if there are scenarios that we didn't cover or questions that you had to ask or that you have to ask on the ones that we did, please reach out to us via social media. We would love to hear from you. It is a conversation, much more interesting with you in it. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razor Leaf. If you have any questions about data quality and AI, we'd love to have that conversation. So just leave a comment on our post or send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We appreciate all the feedback we get from our listeners, so please be sure to send us a note. And also, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform or our YouTube channel. Until next time, stay sharp.